Today on Focal Point, we are going to discuss the American justice system with adjunct professor of paralegal studies David Travascus. Try to solve a Comic Con mystery and hear some opinions about the death penalty. Stay with us. Hi, welcome to Focal Point on CCP TV, the educational channel of Community College of Philadelphia. I'm Darlene Muntz, a student in the Communication Arts curriculum. I am here with Pro Bono Coordinator for Legal Services for the Pennsylvania Bar Association, Mr. David Travascus. He is also a lecturer at the American Institute for History Education and a certified trainer with the Alveus Bullying Prevention Program Training Network. Welcome, David.
Welcome, Darlene. Thank you.
Mr. Travascus, you have a very extensive resume in the legal services, so you must have a great deal of knowledge in the criminal justice system.
Well, it's interesting, Darlene. I come into the focus on justice very broadly. Okay. And when you use a term like justice, it is a huge term, which includes both civil and criminal justice. The poverty work that I do in my main job for the Pennsylvania Bar Association puts me in the field of civil legal aid. So I'm dealing with poor people who are not having the access to the courts that you would think a system of law like our nation is based on would provide. But because I work so much in poverty, you can't get away from the criminal justice aspects of it. Rightly, wrongly, when people talk in this society about the difference between rich and poor in terms of how the criminal justice system deals with them, there is a lot of truth to the idea that the rich have a different access to justice when it comes to crime. So in my poverty work, I see people who, although I am not there working with them as their attorney, because we do have a right, as you hear on the TV shows, to have an attorney in a criminal matter, I am still seeing in court, I'm seeing when they're calling up with issues, how much harder it is for people who are poor to really get that sense that the system works for them. I walk out into our society, I walk on our streets, and a police officer stops me. I don't feel threatened. I grew up in Swarthmore in a well-resourced community where people like the police are there to help me and to protect me. If I'm a young man in places in Philadelphia, in our poorest neighborhoods, in North Central Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, if I'm a young man, especially if I'm a young man of color getting those experiences, I don't have the same reaction. And that is really so much not just an issue of criminal justice, it's an issue of overall justice, and it's an issue that's really tied to poverty. It's tied to the fact that people who are poor really don't feel that this system of justice is working for them. And I think we see that with all the events that have been happening. Philadelphia has been relatively immune to some of the Ferguson-type activities that have happened. But it doesn't mean that we aren't sitting still on a very dangerous and very incendiary situation. So when you talk about being involved in criminal justice, my credibility is not as a criminal lawyer. My work is as a lawyer of poverty.
Where did your interest in legal work come from?
I started law school at Temple, and Temple has a program where our law students would get into the community. Back then, we worked in schools. Today, there's tons of clinical programs that Temple Law School has that weren't there when I went there. But the program they did have when I was there was one where we went and taught in the schools. So I taught at West Philadelphia High School, I taught at Edison, I taught at Germantown, I taught at Martin Luther King. I got into work with kids in the city. Working at Temple, getting that experience, I stayed 17 years at Temple. And because of our work, because we taught about public education, mostly when we went into schools, what kids wanted to know was about their rights when they're stopped by cops, when they're stopped, on the street. The kinds of experiences that, in Swarthmore, you're stopped on the street, you say hello to the officer because you've known them forever, and they probably call you by name. In some of their situations in Philadelphia, you're stopped in the streets, the officers have hands on guns, and you feel threatened. And we would do that experience not only just so the kids would know what to do, and we were very strict with the kids, because basically when you're stopped, what you should do, people with guns I always treat nicely, and since we can carry in Philly these days, I figure everybody has guns. But You say yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am. You get a badge number if somebody's behaving badly, but you don't say I'm going to report you. You get the badge number, and when you're safe, you make those reports. You know what you need to do. You can report through groups like PILCOP, which is our Public Interest Law Center, but you also can report to the police because the police have their own internal mechanisms, and although people say you shouldn't look at that, you should do both. It's funny, in our bullying work we do with the kids, we always tell them to tell an adult at school and an adult at home when they get bullied. And people say, well, you're doubling up. Why do you need to do that? And the reason you do that is you don't always trust that the person at home responds to it right. You don't always trust that the person at school responds to it right. By telling both sides, they get a better chance to respond to it. But that experience didn't only help kids, those lessons, it helped officers because they got to see kids in settings where they weren't being jerks.
David, could you tell us a little more about what you do about bullying prevention?
Well, the bullying prevention is a huge piece throughout the nation, and it's been that way ever since Columbine in 1999, which actually was misdiagnosed as a bullying situation. The newspapers and Time magazine immediately came out that these kids had been bullied, and they targeted and killed the kids who picked on them. That really wasn't the case there. Matter of fact, most kids who get picked on generally hurt themselves and not others. But what is interesting is our work of bullying prevention in Philadelphia after 1999 started because we were working with doctors, Physicians for Social Responsibility, working with doctors in emergency rooms, and they were talking to kids who had been victims of gunshots, kids who had been victims of violence, and they were finding out that a lot of this was tied to getting back at somebody because of something that had happened. Maybe it wasn't quite a bullying situation, but it was an abuse situation. It was a situation where people had felt threatened. And sadly, we've always had an ability to get guns in the city, so weapons were used. And that was actually when we first brought in our very first school-based bullying prevention person. Physicians for Social Responsibility brought in an Olveus trainer in 1999, and she actually worked for them for a couple years before the school district brought her in. And I always say that when we start with the bullying work, when we start young, because I think bullying is a term which when we get to adults, and certainly we get to older young people, let's call it by what it is, because those terms, when I'm a third grader and I push and shove you, that can be bullying, or I say something nasty to you, that can be bullying. When I'm 17 and I push and shove you, that's assault. I say something nasty to you, that's sexual harassment, that's terroristic threats. If I follow you, that's stalking. It's no longer, let's call it for what it is. And in the high school, I don't want to criminalize that behavior, but I do want to label it properly. Because when you're out on the street, it will be criminalized. And I think we need to teach people that. So the bullying work I do, I see it as a really wonderful way. If we can get our kids looking out for each other young, that's the whole piece of bullying, is that it's not just about the victim and the perpetrator, it's about everybody watching it. And if the bystanders get involved and help stop it, that's a model which works beautifully in our communities later on. Because a lot of what happens in the violence in our communities is we've lost that connection in the communities where people look out. You know, if you talk to any old heads, they'll always tell you that when they were little and somebody misbehaved, the mother, anybody's mother, could set you up and make sure that you knew what you were doing was wrong. That community has been lost in a lot of our parts of the city. But there are still places where it's there, and I don't think it's gone forever.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for being with us, David, and thank you for your insight into the United States legal system.
You're most welcome, and thank you.
You're welcome. Now we're going to visit a group of people trying to solve a murder mystery. Take a look.